As all of you should know, Lego is the absolute best toy ever invented for any person of any age, anywhere. I like it very much, and if you've been to this channel before, you also know I like mysterious books. So, when I realized there was a Lego theme about techno-medieval knights with a whole set of mysterious books complete with even a full-on tiny Necronomicon, I was like, yes! My time has come! And then I waited for like 5 years and did nothing. But hey, I'm here now, so let's fix that. My first idea was obviously to make the Book of Monsters, because there can't possibly exist a collection of Books of the Dead without a tiny Lego Necronomicon, but after taking a look at all the other books, I decided to make the Book of Chaos too, since I also think skulls are cool, and the skeleton minifig is probably one of my favorite. So let's start with that, the Book of Monsters, and we'll leave the Chaos one and its many terrible mistakes for next week. As it usually happens with these cartoony projects, there are many versions of the books depending on the media. I decided to go with a design closer to the actual plastic piece. I really like the face, and the tiny book left a lot of details for me to interpret. So the first step is to spend a little bit of time with Photoshop to get the images in the correct proportions and calculate the final size. I try to use some textures that look similar to the materials I have, so I more or less know how it will look in the end. I usually make books bigger, but since this was a tiny Lego book, I went with approximately quarter of a A4 page. For the covers, I started making a couple of black and white versions to print out and glue into the pieces of thin plywood or MDF as reference. And then all of that goes into the scrolls. The covers would have two layers, so the top layer would match these parts over here, and the lower layer would contain the face and the skull on each book. And then comes the usually boring part of folding and sewing the pages. Even if I knew this book would probably never be used, I still wanted it to be functional and open totally fly to write or draw, which sadly needs sewing, or well, this crap. Then I looked for the fanciest possible book and paper I could find, a shiny texture black one for the Book of Monsters and a golden one for the Book of Chaos. And this is when the experiments began. Since the world has become a dystopian nightmare, finding material has become either hard or expensive, so no convenient liquid silicone for me. Instead, I use a mixture of the silicone you might use to seal your windows and cornstarch. It's not perfect, but it's really cheap, so it works for me. I use some Legos to make the molds, obviously. You put a little bit of the silicone dough into the Lego box and then you stick the corners in it. I already had the corners laser cut, and as you can see, these cheap ass molds pick up the details really well, so that went fine. Next step was to actually make copies of the corners. For this, I normally use 2-part epoxy resin, but this time I thought I would leap dangerously and try to make the decorations out of metal. I already bought a long time ago a couple of sticks of roofing solder. It is very easy to melt and relatively cheap, at least cheaper than resin. Problem is, when I was making my first experiments, I used a regular silicone mold, which have a far larger melting point than the solder. But this time, with my cheap molds, even if the silicone was probably just fine, the starch on the mold started cooking with the heat from the molten metal. This created plenty of bubbles, so the pieces ended up having several imperfections on the surface. Luckily, nothing that could not be fixed with a little filing and sanding. For the face, I decided to use Sculpting. It's the second time I've used it and it's just fantastic. I printed out another black and white version of the face and used a plastic film on top so I could have the reference in the absolutely perfect and exact size. Couple of hours later, and when everything's done, in goes into the oven. This part you're watching here is actually our second attempt at baking Sculpting. The first one kind of ended in tragedy, but that's a story for next video. So once the baking is done, I firstly glued the monster face into the 2-layer cover I did before with a bunch of super glue. Later, I filled this dark area with a bit of toilet paper and glue just to add a bit of creepy Necronomicon texture around the face. Once that's complete, it's time for a bit of primer, and then some more paint for the rest of the details. And of course, when everything was ready and painted, I painfully learned that you can just paint a Sculpey. The chemicals that keep it malleable also kind of mess up any acrylic paint you put on top. So as you can see here or here, all the paint started coming off with just touching the piece with too much force. It was already kind of late to rebake it to fix the paint into the Sculpey with heat, since it has already attached to wood and paper, so I just decided to sand everything as best as I could so the paint would have something to grab onto. It actually kind of worked, but it was still a little bit loose, but I wasn't really in the mood to spend another day or two remaking every single piece and remolding the face, so I just finished painting everything and applied a very good amount of transparent varnish. So the paint would be encased in a transparent tomb protected from evil fingers forever. Now that all the parts are ready, it's time to put it all together. As I said, I don't usually go for absolutely perfect detail perfection, so I kept the spine of the book brown even if the animation had a golden one. I also went with just 2 golden straps on the side and attached them with the same roundhead nails I used for the corners. So, what have we learned? Well, first of all, I should have used a matte finish instead of the shiny one for the face. Sadly, I didn't have one. I also should have read a lot more about Sculpting before trying to paint it. Remember, Sculpting is really hard to paint. Regarding the silicone molds, they're cheap and absolutely fantastic for resin casting. Not so great for metal. And I also spilled a lot of molten metal everywhere on my work table, which was, let's say, less than optimal. But in the end, I think the book came out perfectly respectable. And even though I don't have the original tiny Lego books because I was like 6 years late to the store, I have my now ultra-realistic, way too shiny monster book, which makes me really happy. And see you next week for more Lego Mysterious books and more terrible crafting mistakes. Bye!